And welcome to WorldLink TV. Tonight we are offering you another special on WorldLink TV entitled Listening to Beirut, one in a series of programs designed especially to connect nations to nations, neighborhoods to neighborhoods, and people to people. We here at WorldLink TV believe that that is part of our mission to further better understanding amongst all the people of the earth. And tonight we are very excited to bring you probably a television first, connecting you, our viewers, directly with people in Beirut, Lebanon, so that they can hear your questions and your comments, and you can hear directly from them without anybody in between. We hope that you will join us throughout the program, and we look forward to your participation. Now I'd like to introduce our guests for tonight. Joining us from Beirut, Dr. Hassan Kraim, who is a professor of political science at the American University in Beirut since 1990. We are also joined by Dr. Isla Jad, who is a professor of political science at the Institute of Women's and Cultural Studies at Beirut University in Ramallah on the West Bank. She is also co-founder of the Women's Affairs Committee, a coalition of Palestinian women's groups. Here in the studio, I'm joined by Dr. Lawrence Michalak, who is the Vice Chairman of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, and author of the book, The Arab in American Cinema, A Century of Otherness. Later on in the program, we'll be joined by Dr. Samir Amin, who is the Director of the African Office of the Third World Forum. He is a respected economist and author of numerous books and articles on globalization. As I said, he will join us later in the program. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Larry, and welcome to all our folks in Beirut. Before, however, we get into hearing from our guests, we're going to go to a special, tonight, a unique opportunity for you to speak directly with our guests in Beirut. First, we are going to start with an exclusive interview which WorldLink TV produced this week with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, who is a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council and Commissioner for Information and Public Policy for the Arab League.
Well, certainly the events of September 11th have, after the initial horror and shock and total condemnation, certainly brought out the necessity to address issues, to understand the causes, to understand why, what went wrong. The fact that the U.S. is not really isolated from the rest of the world, and whether issues as far away as the Middle East, the Arab world, had any impact on what happened in the U.S. I would say from the beginning, the U.S. certainly had a tremendous amount of goodwill among the Arabs, the people as well as the leadership. The early 20th century, the U.S. was viewed as a champion of the oppressed, as a nation that had undergone a revolution, that had liberated itself from colonial domination and control. And the principles of the American Constitution were taken very seriously as principles that are applicable to the Arab world. Unfortunately, this tremendous amount of goodwill was squandered repeatedly. One, after the First World War, when the Arab world was promised independence and freedom. Instead, it was fragmented and placed under colonial rule, divided, so to speak, by European countries mainly. After the Second World War, instead of getting freedom, we got also not just the perpetuation of domination, but also the creation of the State of Israel in the midst of the Arab world, and at the tragic expense of the Palestinians, where you had close to 1 million Palestinians forcibly expelled, dispossessed, to become refugees throughout the world, where you had hundreds of villages totally erased, eradicated, destroyed, and the rest of the Palestinians came to live under a most punitive and brutal military occupation. And that served repeatedly to undermine American standing and American credibility and interest in the region. It's Israel's behavior that has become a serious liability. At the same time, you have also the sort of simplistic approach to the region, total disregard of Arab public opinion, kind of alliances with regimes that may not have been very democratic. At the same time, during the Cold War, there was an attempt to use the policy of the end justifying the means, whereby the U.S. encouraged extremist organizations, religious parties, in order to combat what it called an Arab nationalism and to prevent the resurgence of an Arab power in the region, and at the same time in order to combat communism. So with communism as the great enemy at that time, the U.S. generated tremendous instability by helping extremist groups form, and particularly the most blatant example right now is the American support for the Mujahideen, and in Pakistan for the Taliban earlier on, and the Bin Ladens of the world, which in a sense created and generated pockets of extremism, of fundamentalism, of tremendous violence in our part of the world. Now, when American interests were no longer there immediately visible, of course the U.S. dropped these erstwhile allies, and they wreaked havoc throughout the region. And now the whole issue is backfiring.
We're back, and we're going to go to our guests in Beirut for our first questions. I'll direct my first question to you, Dr. Hassan Karyem. Do you agree with Dr. Ashwari's assessment that she just rolled out for us on how views have changed about America over the years amongst Arab people?
Yes, I do agree. I think she said it all. She mentioned almost all the most important issues that may characterize the American understanding and misunderstanding of the region and of the people of the region.
As a Lebanese, do you think that the same sentiment is pervasive throughout Lebanon as well? And is there a different viewpoint coming from Lebanon to the United States?
Well, you know, Lebanon perhaps is a place where you can detect several points of views, but generally the official point of view and the predominant point of view is not that different from Hanan Ashraou's point of view. We're Arab after all, and we've been in the region, and we have suffered a lot from the Arab-Israeli conflict and from latest developments since the Second Gulf War. So basically we share such analysis and such findings with other fellow Arabs, and especially the Palestinians.
Hassan, since the attacks of September 11th here in the United States, have viewpoints changed towards America?
Maybe generally there might be a change in degrees, but essentially the same sort of sentiment, same understanding of the role that the U.S. had played in the past and is still playing has not changed. It depends on the American policies themselves. It doesn't seem that there is any change in the American policy towards the region. So in this sense, there is no such change in attitudes toward the American administration.
And let's go to Dr. Isla Jad. Dr. Jad, welcome to WorldLink TV. And we here in America have seen a range of Palestinian sentiment, especially since September 11th. It goes from dancing in the street to being very sympathetic to what has happened in parts of our country with the terrorist attacks. How do you see this issue in how America is perceived by Palestinians?
Well, I could say that the perception of America by Palestinians, it's a kind of love-hate relationship. People do admire American values, American, way of life, American democracy, but in the same time, people are so discontent with the American bias to the State of Israel, especially that Palestinians were under a tremendous, humiliating, systematic policies against the Palestinians on daily basis, at all aspects of life, in their movement to leave the country, in their, economic life, in their cultural life. In all aspects were affected by the Israeli domination and occupation and humiliating policies at all levels and for all people. It doesn't, spare children or women or elderly or sick or even handicapped people. So seeing this and living this, and in the same time seeing the American government or the American policy is in full support, and sometimes, in very outrageous support for the policy of the Israeli government. This led to lots of frustration among the people. This led to lots of anger among the people. And here comes, this discontent with the American policy vis-a-vis Palestinians in particular, and to Arabs in general.
Isla, if you were to pinpoint one misperception of Palestinians by Americans, what would you say that is?
It's basically the total support of the Israeli policies, unfortunately. I mean, how can a government support an act like demolishing, civilian houses? How can a government support the killing of children, even though with this horrible fact that the Israeli policy always tried to demonize us as mothers and as Palestinians, that we are throwing our kids in the streets to be killed by the moral Israeli army. Supposedly that we are so wicked mothers, that we are so evil mothers. How come for an army, well-equipped army, could kill a child in front of them? So this kind of support for this kind of atrocities inflicted on Palestinians, in fact, lead to lots of anger and frustrations.
Thank you, Isla. Larry, let's bring you into the conversation now. You, for many years, have been doing much research. You speak Arabic, write Arabic, read Arabic, and you're American. From your point of view, how are Arabs misunderstood in America?
Well, I speak Arabic a lot better than I read or write it because it's a difficult language and there are many dialects. My main experience has been in North Africa, where I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I began noticing when I came back from having spent several years in the Arab world that there are these very strange attitudes on the part of Americans toward Arabs. People have very strange ideas about the Arab world, and there's a lot of ignorance about the Arab world. So part of what I've done, apart from my more arcane scholarship as an anthropologist, is to try to write some things that analyze these sorts of attitudes and to try to correct them.
And one of your focus points is our cultural perception, how the movies, television, entertainment has portrayed Arabs. A thumbnail sketch, what would you say?
Well, I think that there's a lot of attention paid to the press, a lot of attention paid to the media, to books, but I think that people's attitudes come a lot more from popular culture. And so in my work, I've looked a lot at, for example, American cinema, and at jokes and at comic strips and at political cartoons and things like this that sort of are what Americans begin with when you say Arab. These are what they see when they're little children. These are what they grow up with. So when the students come into the classroom at UC Berkeley, it's not just that they don't know anything about the Middle East and the Arab world, it's that they think they know a lot, and what they think they know is wrong. So you are not starting with a tabula rasa, you're starting with a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes that you have to work to try to correct.
And it seems like now, since September 11th, do you feel that the media has been fairly even-handed with stereotyping Arabs, or?
Well, I haven't really been following all the different newspapers, but I think that the American press tends to support the policy of the president, especially in times of crisis, and we're certainly still in a time of crisis. So I'd say it's a fair generalization to say that the American media have supported the policies of President Bush.
Hassan, there in Beirut, I'd like to ask you, culturally, what is the cultural impression of America that Arabs receive or Lebanese people receive from our movies and films and television? What's the cultural impression? That we're all rich? That we all drive Cadillacs?
Well, yeah, definitely there is a very rich society, very high standard of living, and sometimes there's this understanding also, or perception that there is also a very kind of indifferent people, I do not want to say ignorant, of the outside world. Perhaps this has changed a little, and it is changing already. It's an ongoing process after September 11th. The interest in understanding the outside world has tremendously increased, and so this perhaps, if we can say anything positive out of this crisis, could be a very positive sort of conclusion or consequence, because there will be greater interest in understanding other people outside, other problems, and so on.
And what is it that you feel needs to be resolved right away in order to bring some stability to the region, in order to begin to shift some of the pressures and the stereotyping? What do you see, Hassan, as what needs to be resolved immediately in the Arab world? Is it bringing democracy to all countries? What?
Yeah, I can give you an ideal scenario, but it might not be so realistic. I think there are conflicts in the region that needs to be addressed, and addressed in a just and even-handed manner. Of course, we already talked about the Palestinian conflict, which is the most prominent conflict in the region. But of course, we can talk also about lack of development, not only in the Arab world, but actually in the third world countries at large. We can talk about sort of double standards in dealing with the Arab world and with other regions of the world, where you apply certain standards in certain regions and a different standard in another region. Like there is a lot of resentment in the Arab world in the way that the United States have dealt with Iraq. And how did they make a sort of a distinction between how would they apply UN resolutions against Iraq and using force with all the consequences that affected the Iraqi children in particular, and not the Iraqi regime, which seemed like destroying Iraq as a country and as a society, and not really affecting any political meaningful political outcome out of such a policy, while not applying any of the resolutions or asking for such an application with regard to Israel.
Thank you. And this program is really wanting Americans to connect with our Arab neighbors, and it's very important that we begin that dialogue. So we're going to go to our first phone caller, and I believe that it is Carl in Louisiana. Welcome to WorldLink TV, Carl, and what is your question tonight?
Hello. I don't understand the Arab world. I'd really like to know how they feel about the things that we have done. I never hear about the things that we have done, like in Kuwait, like with the Muslims, with the things that we did for the Muslims in Yugoslavia, all the aid that we've sent to Arab countries, well, Egyptians, and the money we've sent to Afghanistan. do the Arab, you know, the normal everyday people, do they know of these things? Do they, the gentleman was just speaking of Iraq, do they know of the palaces that Saddam Hussein builds and the people there starve? Do they know these kind of things?
Thank you, caller. Isla, the caller brought up a very good point. The United States sends a lot of aid to Egypt, to various other Arab countries. We have a lot of NGOs that go over and do lots of work. Americans feel frustrated about that. That's their tax dollars going over there for relief, and it always feels as though we just get cursed for it. What is that disconnect about?
In fact, not at all. I mean, yes, people do recognize that the Americans aid, you know, some of the Arab countries and some of the Arab regimes too. But in the same time, people know that there is lots of support for some, you know, authoritarian kind of regimes who participate sometimes in oppressing their people or preventing them from a real participation in the political process. So people want to see Americans using their influence to pressure maybe these governments to allow more participation for their people and allow more, you know, expression of their views concerning their daily concerns. Right now in Egypt, we see that lots of people are willing to demonstrate, to show their support for the Palestinians in their plight, you know, under the Israeli occupation. The governments, to please the Americans, they are oppressing, you know, these kind of people and these kind of demonstrations. So people do feel that Americans are helping by providing some aid here and there, but in the same time, people are so angry, as I said before, and so frustrated by this lack of fulfilling their political aspirations and their political dreams. Because if Americans could support Arab people and Arab governments in ending, you know, their suffer, especially in Palestine, especially with Palestinians, I think the image of the American as a superpower in the world will change. They feel that America has lots of power, but using this power in unfair and unjust way. So helping here and there is not enough in itself unless, you know, hopes and aspirations of the people, especially in ending their daily humiliation and their daily suffer caused by the Israeli policy in the region, you know, this is something drastically needs to be changed.
Thank you, Isla. Let's go to another caller, and we're going to go to Maureen in California. Welcome, Maureen, to our connection here. And what's your question?
Yes, good evening. This question is for Hassan Trayem, or anyone there who could answer this. I understand that there are many terrorist cells involved in other countries of the world, aside from Osama bin Laden. I'm wondering what will happen once Osama is captured with remaining cells, and what are the other Arabic leaders going to do to control the other terrorist cells once this is over?
Hassan, did you hear that clearly? The question is, once Al-Qaeda network or bin Laden is put to bed or put out of the picture, what happens to other groups that have now been labeled terrorists, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, other organizations? And what will the Arab countries do about them?
First of all, I don't think that it's a common sense and acceptable that other groups are considered here terrorist groups. There is a lot of rejection to such simplistic dichotomy. All those who are against the U.S. policy are considered terrorists, and those who go with the United States are considered freedom fighters. I think this should be addressed by the American administration itself. There are more than 400 organizations in the United States that are labeled terrorist organizations. Of course, the way the U.S. administration is handling the crisis, and let me always emphasize that I'm talking here about the American administration, not about the American people. And we sympathize a lot with the American people, especially the victims of such terrorist acts that happened on September 11. But let us see how are they handling the crisis. The American administration is ignoring the root causes behind such terrorism in the world, and trying just to use might and power and military power to overcome the poorest country in the world. And the victims, again, are the Afghani civilians in particular. I don't think that such a military strategy is leading anywhere with the Al-Qaeda or with the Taliban.
Right.
They are in trouble.
Thank you, Hassan. Larry, would you like to comment on that? You heard Maureen's question, and do you have any comments about ongoing efforts to eradicate so-called terrorism?
Well, I think that what I would pick up on is your last comment about so-called terrorism, because there are things that we can certainly agree are terrorism. For example, nobody disagrees that the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York was an act of terrorism. It most certainly was. But it's been said, and it's become almost a cliche, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I'm afraid that there's a lot of truth to that statement. So what we've just heard is that there are groups that are perceived as terrorists in the United States on the part of some people, which are perceived as freedom fighters in the Arab world. And one can see there's a certain amount of legitimacy to each point of view.
Thank you, Larry. Let's go to another caller. I believe we'll hear from Abraham in Miami. Good evening, Abraham, and welcome to WorldLink TV. What's your question?
Thank you. Good evening. Fabulous program. Professor in the studio, I would like to ask you a question. Initially, I'd like to say that I believe that the American people in general are very much for the ends of justice. But I also believe that, unfortunately, there are very miseducated, misled, and uneducated population regarding the Middle East and Arabs in particular. I'd like to, and I believe that the professor had suggested that as well, that there are these images, perhaps false images or falsely based images. I'd like to ask the professor, is that by coincidence, or would you say there's a, you referred to pop culture. What forces are behind pop culture? Are they coincidental forces, or are they designed forces?
Thank you, Abraham. Good
Thank
question.
Well, I should say, first of all, I'm not a professor. I'm a lecturer and an administrator at UC Berkeley, and also I don't speak for the university. I only speak for myself. But I think you've got a good question there. What are the causes of this terribly negative image of Arabs and of Middle Easterners and Muslims in general in the United States? There are a lot of different theories about it, but my idea is that one reason is that these are the people that Americans tend to know the least. If you look at American society, there aren't any real Americans except Native Americans, and even they came over a land bridge from Asia. People have come from all over the world. But those that have come from the Middle East are perhaps the smallest group, and people rarely have ever met them. And so early in the 20th century, for example, when people started making movies for the first time, the most exotic place they could imagine was the Middle East, and so they projected all their fantasies on that part of the world. The negativity also, I think, comes from the fact that we have a relatively European outlook on the world. The dominant group in America, the dominant groups have all come from Europe, and Europe has a tradition of fearing Muslims. Most recently, they feared the Ottoman Empire, and before that, they feared the Arab world because the Arabs had come up, occupied Spain for many centuries, and so there's a European tradition of fearing Arabs, fearing Turks, and stereotyping negatively Muslims in general. That's my theory.
But also, Larry, not all Arabs are Muslim.
That's true.
And this seems to get lumped into, and not all Muslims are Arabs.
Exactly.
And we seem to have a real misunderstanding about that.
Yeah, well, not all Arabs are Muslims, but about 90% of them are. On the other hand, you said not all Muslims are Arabs, and that's for sure. Only a small portion of the Muslims in the world are Arabs. There are about 250 million Arabs, and there are probably 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. And the largest country of Muslims is Indonesia. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about Islam in the United States, and there is a tendency also to lump together Turks and Persians and Arabs in sort of one group and assume that these are the major group of Muslims in the world, when actually there's about a third in the Middle East, a third in South Asia, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and about a third in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and other countries in that area.
And I take it, Larry, that the Quran is translated into all those languages, including South Asian languages and whatnot, or are they read in Arabic?
Well, the Quran is translated into a lot of languages, but there's controversy about it, because some people take the position that the Quran should not be translated from Arabic, that you should learn Arabic if you want to read the Quran, because it's the Word of God transmitted by the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, so people should make the effort to learn the language. Other people, though, say no. If the purpose is to give people the truth, then you want to make it accessible to as many people as possible, and therefore not only could you translate the Quran, but you should translate the Quran. So it's a controversial question, actually.
Well, it seems there is much diversity of thought within Islam as there is within Christianity or Judaism.
Exactly. And Islam, Christianity, and Judaism have, in fact, a great deal in common. All three are Abrahamic religions, which came from the same part of the world, which are militantly monotheistic, which believe in prophets, and one could go on to point out the similarities. And yet, in the United States, currently, you have some people who are arguing that there's some kind of a dichotomy between the Judeo-Christian tradition on one hand and Islam on the other hand, when they're really part of the same tradition fundamentally.
Well, maybe we can get on to that. We're going to take a break right now. We don't want you to go away. Make sure that you continue to connect with us here on WorldLink TV. And when we come back, we'll have a special video from Hezbollah TV. So stay with us and make sure that you have your phones ready to call. Thank you.
This is WorldLink TV.
Welcome back to WorldLink TV's special presentation, Listening to Beirut. I'm your host, Nicole Sawaya. Joining me here in the studio is Dr. Lawrence Michalak. Again, welcome, Larry. And with us, interconnected through the wonders of technology in Beirut, Dr. Hassan Krayem and Dr. Isla Jad. This is live. I believe it's very early in the morning in Beirut, so we're very pleased that our guests would be up with the roosters and join all of us. And this is an interactive television show. It depends on you, our viewers, to call us or email us with your questions or comments. Now, very shortly, we will be going to a bit of a videotape, which was taken yesterday from Hezbollah TV from Beirut, Lebanon. We'll be going to that in just a few seconds. And as we go to that, we are continuing with the question about one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And now let's see this video clip.
والحياة في موتكم قاهرين.
And that was it. Some probably promotional video about Hezbollah, certainly not in depth. But let's go to our guests in Beirut and find out. Freedom fighters, terrorists. Hassan, we'll start with you. You are in Lebanon, have been there for many years. You are Lebanese for 25 years. Lebanon was occupied by the Israelis in South Lebanon, who marched all the way up to Beirut. Recently, Hezbollah claimed to have liberated the south of Lebanon. And now they hold seats in government. Isn't there representatives in government from Hezbollah?
In the parliament, not in government. But let me go back a little bit and say this is a good case where we should set the criteria to make a distinction between a terrorist group and a national liberation movement group, for instance. It's just like the French resistance fighting the Nazis. It's just like the Americans, actually, nowadays defending themselves. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1978 the first time, and then in 1982 and reached Beirut the year 2000. Throughout these years, there were several different forces fighting the Israelis, resisting the occupation because they were defending themselves, defending their homes, defending their land. And that's just the case with the Palestinians. They are not attacking because they are war-prone. They are being attacked, and they are defending themselves and responding to this long occupation of their towns and their cities and their land and their water resources and the severe conditions that they are living under. It's just
Hassan,
like also to an extent.
If I may ask, though, if I can just interrupt for a minute. Our understanding is that Lebanon has now pulled out of the coalition because President Bush declared Hezbollah a terrorist organization and will be freezing the assets of Hezbollah. What is the reaction right now in the streets of Beirut and in Lebanon regarding, in the past 24 hours, this announcement about Hezbollah?
A lot of resentment, of course, because we have to realize who are these people, Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is the Lebanese resistance that fought against Israeli occupation, along with other actually forces that also fought the Israeli occupation. They are Lebanese people. They are living in their homes and in their towns and in their villages, and they were defending themselves and their towns. So a lot of resentment for such a position, which has a political implication more than anything else. And there is a lot of fear that there is this insistence on behalf of the American administration to widen the campaign and to include other groups in the Arab world and in other parts of the world, while what is needed is really to rethink such positions and maybe go back to the United Nations instead of taking unilateral attitude, unilateral policy with regard to these issues. Let alone that, as I said, there is a double standard policy here, because you take a stand against Hezbollah, but you never take a stand against your own terrorist organizations in the United States, or your own or Israeli terrorist groups in Israel. And you know that there are some terrorist groups.
Okay, let's go to a caller, because this is really about being able to connect Americans with our guests in Beirut and also with our in-studio guests. So let's hear from Baba in Oklahoma City. Good evening, Baba, and welcome to WorldLink. What's your question?
Well, I want to ask anybody on the panel there, say, knowing the history of America, slavery, murder, genocide of Indians, and hypocrisy, what makes you think that America would treat Arabs any differently? And I'd like to know that you really believe that America is the great stronghold of justice and truth, freedom and democracy. And if you believe that, I'd like to know where's justice when blacks are killed by authorities in America. And if you're not white and live in America, you'll be tolerated to some degree, but you'll never be accepted. Can anybody respond?
Well, Baba, thank you very much. Would anybody care to respond? Isla Jad or Hassan? Our time is very precious with you. And Larry, we also want you to respond, but would either of you like to respond to Baba's question and comment?
Yes, please. I think that's a very essential issue to get beyond the stereotyping of Arabs. I think that it is true that there is a lot of problems of misunderstanding of other people also in the United States, not only of Arabs and Muslims, but also of African American and Hispanic, Latinos, and other groups, and there is a lot of truth in the structure of such a system, which is in itself biased towards a certain group, a certain culture, a certain point of view, and this theory of a melting pot is not really working, because you see more often that there is some sort of hegemony, some sort of dominant ideology and dominant views disregarding other cultures, other other ethnicities, other religions, and so on. While what is needed is more understanding, and your program perhaps is playing such a role in this, and tolerance and better interactions in order to facilitate such understanding of other people.
Isla, I'd like to get a response from you, and thank you, Hassan, because we definitely hope that this program is the beginning of that kind of understanding from neighbor to neighbor, no matter where our borders may be. Isla, you heard Baba in Oklahoma City and his comments. How can Arabs expect justice or any kind of understanding when we're not quite sure we always have that in our melting pot with ourselves and our neighbors?
Yes, it's a complicated problem, but you know, the responsibility of the American government outside its border, it's also very important. And here we feel it very strongly. We feel, you know, the frustration of seeing somebody with this tremendous power and in the same time acting in an unjust and unfair way. So I think the responsibility of the American government and the struggle of all different minorities and ethnic groups within the American melting pot is also very important for the American government to change its policies vis-a-vis other minorities and other different groups other than the mainstream white middle class Americans. And to change this, I think, you know, justice is built in any democratic system. I mean, you know, taking the very liberal view that, you know, democracy and freedom could be achieved only through a process of elections, or, you know, feeling everybody that he or she is participating in election, it's not enough in itself. Social justice is crucial here, and for us in the region, I think it's very easy solution. Once we are recognized as a people with political aspirations, having the right to establish our own state, I think this will solve lots of problems in this area, and this will prevent many other terrorist or not terrorist groups to claim that they are defending the Palestinian rights, or defending or, you know, presenting themselves as a lawyer for the Palestinian freedom and independence. Having a Palestinian state in our area will prevent lots of atrocities coming in the future, I think.
Thank you, Isla. Larry, I'd like to have you comment on that, but we have another caller, and we do want to get to as many callers as possible. So I believe Donovan from Corpus Christi, Texas, is on the line. Good evening, Donovan. Welcome to WorldLink TV, and what's your question?
Yes, good evening, and thank you very much for taking my call. My question is, I personally...
Well, Larry, I may get you then to comment. I'd like to reverse it a little bit, and maybe you're not the best person to direct this to. So I'm going to direct it to our guests in Beirut again. Isla, I'm going to reverse that question. I'm going to say, what about the tolerance level in other Arab countries of difference, of otherness? Whether it's of ethnicity, of religious backgrounds, of class. When the Saudis and the Kuwaitis come on vacation in Lebanon, how does that make the Lebanese feel? what's the tolerance in the Middle East like and with Arab people?
Tell you something before, and I will go back here to the Israeli-Palestinian questions, because there are lots of misunderstanding and lots of stereotyping here. And we have been, suffering from the creation of the State of Israel and all, atrocities coming from the Israeli occupation, even though we were not at all responsible about the Jewish plight, before the Second World War or even after that. I mean, we live in a place with different minority groups. We have Berbers, we have Christians, we have Jews, we have Kurds, we have different minorities. And I wouldn't say that we are perfect people and we are very tolerant. There are some problems here and there, but also you can find lots of intermarriage, you can find lots of tolerance, and it never reached the point to commit a pogrom or, atrocities like it happened in Europe against gypsies or against Jews or against different minorities or against black in America, or Indians in America.
Thank you, Isla.
In general,
we have our caller back, so we're going to go back to our caller. Donovan, I believe you are back on the line from Corpus Christi, Texas. And just remember to stand away from your television because that's what causes the feedback. So Donovan, we want to hear your questions, so please, again.
Yes, thank you.
Certainly.
My question is, I hear a lot about the Israeli occupation, and my question is regarding the current Syrian occupation, and I'm wondering what thoughts are of our two panelists on the current Syrian occupation and Washington's policy, as many view in the America that this is a major setback for Lebanon and Syrians' continued overt support of terrorist activities worldwide. And I'm anxious to hear what our panelists feel about Washington's policy and what is the feeling of the Lebanese people.
Hassan, what is the feeling of the Lebanese people towards the Syrians?
Definitely, there is a problem in the Syrian-Lebanese relationship. No one denies this. But let me, if I may, go back and say, if we are to look at the problems in the Arab world, I think there are a lot of problems, no denial of this also, and two wrongs do not make right. I think we should just set the standards for tolerance in all societies, in the United States as well as in the Arab world. We should set the standards for equal treatment, equal opportunity everywhere. So if there are wrongdoings in the Arab world, I would not defend this, and I know that there has been such a problem historically with certain minorities, but I don't think that the United States have helped in finding solutions to such conflicts. We make a distinction between Syria and Israel. Syria is an Arab country, and Syria intervened in Lebanon in 1976 during the Civil War and continued its presence in Lebanon since that time. The Taif Agreement that was signed in 1989 and became part of the Constitution in 1990 stipulated that there should be some sort of withdrawal to certain places after 2 years. In 1992, it should have been in 1992. But this did not happen, of course, because of the deal that was struck between the American administration that time and the Syrian regime as they participated in the Second Gulf War in 1990 and later in Madrid conferences for peace negotiations. Israel is considered a foreign entity and an enemy to Lebanon, and the occupation was a forceful imposed occupation that was resisted gradually by all Lebanese eventually.
Well, thank you, Hassan. And we're getting a little too specific here. So let's go to a broader concept. I have a quote here from a Kuwaiti political scientist, Shafiq Jabra. And he says, he was recently quoted in the New York Times, where he said, the Lebanese Civil War was not an American creation, neither was the Iran-Iraq War, neither was bin Laden. These are our creations. We need to look inside. We cannot be in this blame others mode forever. Do you agree that the Arabs are locked into a blame the others mode? Do you agree with this statement?
Not to a point where the responsibility of the United States would not be at the table. I think, yes, there are problems that are internal, and the Arabs should deal with their own problems. But at the same time, let me tell you that we feel strongly that along with such internal causes for our problems, there are also external causes. And mostly after colonialism ended in the 50s and 60s, it is the U.S. Hegemony and U.S. strategic interest. And we can feel this in the control of oil production, pricing of oil transportation, and military presence in the Gulf area for that purposes. What is called the strategic interest of the United States. Part of it also, this strategic alliance between the United States and Israel, which we think is serving also the United States administration's interest, because there is like common interest in controlling the region. They trust the Israelis, of course, more than anybody else to serve such an end.
Thank you, Hassan. I'd like to bring Larry into the conversation here. Larry, I want to bring you into the conversation. Sure. You've heard the reactions, the questions, and whatnot. What are your thoughts as somebody who is an expert about how Arabs are perceived in this country? As I said, you've studied the Arab culture in depth. You know the language, which is so integral to having an understanding of people. What's your perception on these issues?
Well, Shafiq Jabra is a very interesting person. He's a Kuwaiti political scientist that I met, and I found it fascinating to listen to him because he gave a Kuwaiti perspective on the Middle East. And I found that as Americans, we're used to looking at the world from the perspective of the United States, geographically and in every way. And it was interesting to listen to him and to hear how someone from Kuwait perceives the world. So imagine you're in this very tiny country that's only a little more than 100 miles tall and 100 miles wide, with lots and lots of oil and huge, gigantic neighbors that are very, very powerful. And there are a lot of things that flow from that. I found that it was, when I did go to Kuwait, that it was very different than I thought it would be, and it brought home the point that these countries are all different. I had assumed that Kuwait would be very much like Saudi Arabia, but I found that the women were not veiled in Kuwait. I found that they had an elected parliament. I found that they had political parties, including a Muslim party that was nonviolent, and that they had active criticism of the monarchy. And so it was a great surprise to me because I had assumed it's a monarchy that has oil, so it's probably like Saudi Arabia, and it's not. I guess the point would be just to emphasize the diversity in the Arab world. There are 22 countries, they're all different, and even within countries such as Lebanon. Lebanon is an incredibly diverse place and a very complicated place. And I have great sympathy for people in the news who try to report things that happen in Lebanon, which are very complicated and which are difficult to reduce to 20-second, 30-second sound bites.
Absolutely. Let's go to another caller. Let's hear from Lynn in northern Idaho, I believe, or Idaho. Good evening, Lynn, and welcome to WorldLink TV. And what's your question?
Good evening, and I'd like to thank you for this lifeline to the world because, as most everyone in the rest of the world knows, our media is so managed. We are so isolated that way. We have very few outlets and inlets to find out what's going on. My comment is, one, do people in the rest of the world and in the Arab nations realize there are many of us in this country who are horrified at the atrocities that our government is doing. We are not in agreement. The United We Stand slogan is a media spin that many people disagree with. And two, this is a question I've wondered for quite a while. If people in other countries realize that our government, and mainly some of the other larger governments, the actions that are being taken by these governments have little to do with the people in these countries and more to do with the multinational businesses and families that really have no allegiance to countries, but are in search of power and control over all of us and keeping us all fighting with one another.
Thank you, Lynn. That's great context. But do you have a question for our guests?
This is what I want to know. Do the people in other countries realize that we are not united with this, and there are many, many people that do not agree with this action? And two, do they have any concept that it is not the government's? I mean, it's...
Thank you, Lynn, for those questions. Thank you very much. And let's go to our guests in Beirut. Isla, I'd like to start with you. You heard the questions. Are you aware that perhaps not all Americans are behind our current actions now in Afghanistan, the bombing of Afghanistan, and also in the past with our policies that have affected people in the Middle East and throughout the world?
Absolutely. We realize very well that lots of Americans also are in support for Arabs in their, causes. We know we have lots of friends and different American groups are also giving lots of support for the Palestinian people in their struggle against Israeli occupation. We know also that, many activists in the United States are taking positions against the policy of their government against, war in Afghanistan, against war when it was in Vietnam, and against, using the use of power to kill civilians and to achieve certain goals through, military means. I think we as Palestinians and also as a woman, we feel the most, the suffering of the loss and the suffering of the death, and that's why we sympathize to a great deal with lots of American families, after what happened in the Twin Towers. And yes, maybe the media showed in a very aggressive and repeated way some kids and few Palestinians celebrating what happened, but let me assure you that this is not at all the case among the Palestinians, and this is not the way we feel vis-a-vis what happened in America. But in the same time, saying this, we do count on, American public opinion and American popular support to pressure more their government to take a just and fair stand vis-a-vis the plight of the Palestinians against the Israeli occupation.
Thank you,
we
Isla.
know that
I'd like to go to the second part of Lynn's question, which was that she felt that multinationals are usually behind, and here we come to the whole concept of globalization and multinational corporations, et cetera, are often the beneficiaries of so much that go on as government so-called policy. Now, I'd like for all of you to join in on this, because I don't think that multinationals are just one way. They are global corporations, and there are people making profits all over the world from them. It's not just some American phenomena. Larry, it's a two-way street. What about those who benefit from the globalization of commerce, et cetera, who are in Saudi Arabia, or who are in Syria, or who are in Egypt? I mean, certainly there are beneficiaries as well. It's not just all American beneficiaries.
Well, there is a very important economic element to all of this that's going on, which isn't discussed a whole lot, and that has to do with how the oil from the Caspian Sea is going to find a route to the Indian Ocean or the Mediterranean or wherever, or the Black Sea. And Afghanistan is a very important player in all this. Having said that, though, and agreeing with you that the multinational corporations are not just American, the profits go to whomever invests in them, which includes Middle Eastern countries. But having said that, I think that there's a lot more to policy than that. For example, the U.S. intervention in Kosovo, when we helped the Muslims in Kosovo who were being attacked by the Serbians, finally after waiting for years and years while the Bosnians were raped and murdered and mistreated. I happened to be in North Africa when that was going on, and it was amazing to read the press because they were very surprised. They said, my goodness, the United States is helping Muslims who live in the former Yugoslavia, and they don't have any oil there. And it was really quite something.
It's pretty cynical.
So there really, I don't think, was any multinational corporation motivation behind the actions in the former Yugoslavia. Also the intervention in Somalia. These are strange things that don't really fit with the economic interpretation of American foreign policy, but economics plays a very important role. It's one of several things.
Hassan and Isla, just a quick answer on this question. Has it been a curse or a blessing for the Arabs to have oil underneath? Curse or a blessing to have so much oil?
I think it's both. It could have been a blessing if it was used for the benefits of developing the region, but because of the lack of such a strategy, it turned to be a curse.
Isla, curse or a blessing? Oil.
Can I comment on the questions that was asked before, please? I think there should be some sort of common values. I think that what's taking place now is telling us that might is not always right. At least it's not sufficient by itself. There should be some sort of moral consideration and moral values. Of course, we understand and we sympathize with the American people and victims everywhere. And for that matter, I think the Americans also are sympathizing with the victims in Afghanistan, because the Afghani people are the victims in Afghanistan. So in this manner, we do know that there are differences, and we see demonstrations taking place in major cities and campuses, and even in Europe, in England and other countries. I started by making this distinction between the official American administration's policy, regardless of the ideological package that comes under national interest, and the people's attitude and people's interest. I think there are differences, and we see these differences, and we actually try to connect with the American people in particular, because it is in our interest to be understood by the American people and to understand also the American people.